that we take a moment to make some connections. Whenever we have a massive disaster like Hurricane Helene, it's important that we think not just about the lives that are lost. And as you heard there, for those of you who are listening on Urban View, more than 100 dead as of this most recent reporting, which was as of just just an hour or so ago. But what we expect is that that number is going to increase, because if any of you have paid attention to any of the footage that's been out there, any of the videos or the images, it is absolute utter devastation. And as we heard in that clip, the devastation goes from Florida all the way up to Ohio. There was devastation from the easternmost regions of North Carolina all into Tennessee. And it's so important that we make connections, because the entirety of our country, the entirety of our planet is going to be dealing with hurricanes that are far more powerful than they've ever been before. Going to be dealing with natural disasters, fires, hurricanes, typhoons, tornadoes, greater than they ever have been because of climate change. And I know a lot of people on the right wing don't like to talk about climate change. I know that Project 2025, which we're going to get to in just a minute, wants to eliminate many of the national agencies that deal with climate change and help us have access to the data that we need to make sure that we're going to stay safe. So it's very important that while we are paying attention and praying for the lives that are lost, I'm so grateful that we heard from Vice President Kamala Harris there, as she is heading back to DC so that she and President Biden can meet with FEMA. They've already distributed 3,300 personnel, as you heard there, released hundreds of millions of dollars in disaster aid to the states that requested them. Because as we spoke about in the previous segment, there were some states, Republican-led, hey Tennessee, that decided not to request aid until after the storm had already hit. And then by delaying the request for aid, we're able to say things like, where is Vice President Kamala Harris and President Joe Biden? They've abandoned us. No, you dimwits. You as governor of the state of Tennessee decided to wait to request your disaster declaration, whereas other states that got their disaster requests in early have already started receiving the money and the resources. So what we are horrified by is whenever there's a politicization of these issues for personal gain, but that's exactly what many of these Republican leaders and operatives are engaged in. But that's not really the connection I want to make. The connection I want to make is, number one, aren't we glad that the federal government didn't shut down last week the way Republicans wanted? Because who would be there to help these people if the federal government was shut down? That's number one. Remember, we talked about the fact that they wanted to shut down the government. Why? So that they could get the SAVE Act legislation included in their package. And what did that SAVE Act legislation do? Make it extraordinarily difficult for married women to be able to vote. Remember that conversation we had last week? Let's make some connections, because one of the things Americans are not very good at, we're not very good at long-term memory. We're not very good at making connections. And so that's my job. And that's why I'm here, to help us understand how these things are connected. I also want to give a shout out to the activists who have been fighting to prevent institutions like Cop City in Atlanta. Why? Because this devastation, as I said, went from the easternmost regions of North Carolina all the way up into Ohio, all the way over to Tennessee, including Georgia and from Florida. And what we know is that in Atlanta, for example, where you're dealing with a lot of flooding, according to the reports, that your city is trying to spend $67 million taxpayer dollars to remove an additional 300 acres of forest wetlands which are what? A natural sponge for rainwater and floodwaters, but they want to remove an additional 300 acres of forest wetlands so that they can build this gigantic police compound to train officers the way we train them here in New York City, who are also being taught by the Israeli Defense Forces about how to police, basically. And so when we're talking about climate change and we're talking about policy, and often, on this show, I get accused of being, too favoring to the Democrats. But let's be clear, it's Democratic leadership in the city of Atlanta that's moving this forward. And so when we're thinking about what climate change look like and how climate change is also connected to racism and environmental racism, it's important that we're making these connections. There's another connection that I want to make, because right now one thing we're clear about, and I want to get that clip ready because I want them to hear from the folks in Project 2025. Project 2025, as we've discussed extensively, is very much in a document that seeks to eliminate the capacity of federal agencies. Republicans don't like federal agencies. Republicans would rather that instead of having a federal agency like the Food and Drug Administration, which would set rules that say, well, you got to have this, and these are the elements that we need to see in order for your factory to be considered a clean factory. These are the elements that we need to see in order for your slaughterhouse to be considered a clean slaughterhouse. Remember how in the Republican administration under Donald Trump, they passed legislation that weakened the government agencies and allowed these corporations to police themselves. And now Boar's Head brand meats, which used to be one of the most expensive, high quality brands of meats in this country, is damn near in the trash, in the toilet in terms of its reputation because of the listeria breakouts and all of the germ and the mold and all the things that were found in their factories because they no longer had government agencies and inspectors coming to inspect their factories. They were doing it on their own. And as a result, people have died. Listeria outbreaks are all over the country and their brand is being pulled off the shelves. An entire wonderful brand that used to be very much more expensive than the other brands. Now they're shutting down factories because when you police yourselves and when you destabilize the capacity for governmental agencies to do their job and you incentivize corporations to cheat and to cut corners, well, you get these sorts of connections. But I'm talking about weather. We're talking about Hurricane Helene. What does this same attitude and approach to governmental agencies, how does that impact what we're talking about today? I'm so glad you asked. So when it came to my concerns about this storm, it wasn't just about what's happening now. It's also about what's happening, what they're planning to happen in the future. I'm in Superstorm Sandy area. Right now, we are getting solar panels put on our houses because we are in an environment where it was clear after Superstorm Sandy that we could not have power lines that are above ground. We were going to have power lines and power sources that were going to be below ground. We were going to have to use solar powers. We were going to have to move from the traditional forms of energy that we were using to more renewable forms of energy. And so there are governmental programs right now for people who live in New York and New Jersey and the surrounding states to make sure that we are doing what we can to weatherize and to prepare for drastic weather because we are all subjected to drastic weather. Asheville, North Carolina, that town that ain't on the map anymore, 450 miles, like hundreds of miles from the coast, wiped out by a hurricane. And so it's important for us to be mindful and not very demure about what it is that elected officials are planning when it comes to FEMA, when it comes to NOAA, which is the National Oceanographic, I always mess up that word, agency, the National Weather Service. These are agencies that track hurricanes. These are agencies that let us know where they're going to land, what the storm surges are going to look like so that we can prepare as best we can. It's challenging because when a hurricane like the one that just landed goes from a category 1 to a category 4 almost overnight, it's difficult to adjust. And frankly, even if you had the best of planning, nobody in the high mountain region of Appalachia was planning on getting wiped out. It just so happens that we're in a society right now, we're in a world right now where because corporations are able to essentially pollute as much as they want, we don't have the 60 votes in the Senate that would allow for real meaningful climate change, then more of this is coming. More of this is on the way. However, I want you all to listen what the arbiters, what the authors of Project 2025 want to do with these agencies. The FEMA agency, the NOAA agency, the National Weather Service agency, they have a plan for these agencies as well. Amina and Instagram, you guys should be able to hear this. We're going to play this out loud. Amina, let's hear what they want to do, what the Project 2025 authors want to do, and what their plans are for this sort of disaster relief in the future. Let's listen.
For instance, on shrinking FEMA and focusing on its mission of backing up states. People think of it as a first responder. It's not a first responder. States and localities are the first responders. FEMA is there to back them up. And if we focus them more narrowly, when they're deployed, they will do a better job. And they'll be deployed in those areas that are highest priority, highest need. So it's conservative, limited government approaches like that you'll see throughout the chapter.
Conservative, limited government like that. That man said they want to shrink FEMA. That man said they want to shrink NOAA. They want to shrink these agencies because they don't want these agencies to be the first responders. They want your states to handle that. So good luck with that. They don't want the federal government to play a role in this. And a lot of folks thought that I was being hyperbolic when I was talking about the fact that Project 2025 wants to cancel all of the funding that people are relying upon right now. But I wasn't the only one. We had the League of Conservation Voters who said on Twitter, reminder that Project 2025 would dismantle the National Weather Service and NOAA. Again, NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We had from Brian Tyler Cohen. He says, as Florida prepares for a major hurricane to make landfall this week, don't forget that Donald Trump's Project 2025 would eliminate the National Weather Service and NOAA. There were a lot of commentary about this. Even Representative Jared Moskowitz out of Florida said that Project 2025 wants to get rid of NOAA, wants to get rid of the National Weather Service, the people that tell you the weather to help you prepare for the hurricanes. But people still thought that folks like me were being hyperbolic. So let's unpack it a little bit. What would the recovery relief effort look like under Donald Trump's Project 2025? And so we can look at the Project 2025. There are 4 key pages that I'm going to draw from this article from PBS that kind of synthesizes it for us. Basically, the National Weather Service, which is one of 6 NOAA offices and provides weather and climate forecasts. The National Hurricane Center is also part of this agency. And they describe in the document, they describe NOAA as a primary component of the climate change alarm industry. So whereas we see these agencies as being able to give us information about how the weather is going to impact our lives, what the disaster efforts are going to look like, they see it as a part of the climate alarm industry because they don't believe in climate change. They think that people who talk about climate change are just trying to make money off of scaring people about climate change. Literally. And I see that somebody's talking about black politicians. Yes, you are not wrong. in the comments, you are not wrong. We're going to talk about black politicians. Hey, Eric Adams, in just a little bit. But in Project 2025, while they're not trying to cancel the agencies entirely, they want to focus on data gathering services, and they want to fully commercialize forecasting operations, which means they want private agencies to do it. They want private industry, the same sorts of private industry that just destroyed the Boar's Head brand. They want private industry to be the brand or to be the folks who are going to be in charge of our weather forecast. According to Project 2025, they said that the National Weather Service could be a performance-based organization. They want to defund it. And they want to say, well, listen, if you predicted hurricanes were going to be bad and the hurricane wasn't that bad, then your performance is awful. And so as a result of your bad performance, you're going to get further defunded. This is how they're approaching mission critical services that all of us rely upon. They talk about the fact that the administration will no longer, the NOAA and the Weather Service, they will no longer be independent agencies. They would be subject to the power of the president. And in this case, Donald Trump would be the president that they're envisioning. Do you remember the last time Donald Trump was in office and there was a hurricane of note? Remember how he determined that the hurricane was going to go off into Alabama and the Weather Service was like, that's not where the hurricane is going. So this man took a whole ass Sharpie and drew his own little weather map, and that was what he wanted to be accounted as. Do y'all remember this? Because people be forgetting that like Donald Trump was a whole ass president before. So we have data. We know what he was looking at. We know what he was doing. Do y'all remember this time when he drew a freaking Sharpie around Alabama? It was like, no, the hurricane's going to go over there. And everybody who was an expert was like, the man is crazy. The man is insane. That's not where the hurricane. And guess what? The hurricane didn't go there because Donald Trump don't get to determine where the hurricanes go. But in a Trump Project 2025 era, then Donald Trump would get to have the final say. And his Sharpie drawn maps would be the maps that would be able to determine where our resources were going to go. And if you just so happen to be a descendant from one of those quote unquote shithole countries, I guarantee you, if your states are in charge of this recovery effort with no backing from the federal government, I guarantee you it's going to be problems. Similar to what we are seeing when it comes to those Republican states that decided to politicize their request for federal dollars. Keep it in mind, the federal government cannot send you disaster relief until it has been formally requested by the head of your state. So when the governor of Tennessee delayed and took his sweet ass time to make the request just so he could say it took President Biden a long time to get the relief here, people are dying while you are politicizing and weaponizing this tragedy. So when we're talking about this administration, not the current administration, but we're talking about what they are planning, it's important that we're mindful, and it is important that we compare it to what this current administration is already doing. They're already on the ground. They're doing what they're supposed to do. They've already sent in the resources. They're sending more resources. President Biden has said he is going to go tour these areas so long as his touring will not disrupt the survival efforts that are engaging right now. Donald Trump, I believe, is right down. I think he's also heading out as well. The reason President Biden is waiting is because when President Biden travels, it requires a lot of security apparatus and resources, and he does not want those resources to be taken from the people who are actually in need. But right now we have entire towns wiped off the map. We have entire neighborhoods and communities that no longer exist. We have entire this storm has reshaped the map. The political map, the electoral map, the geographic map has been completely undone by climate. And what we have to figure out is, do we want an administration, when we're thinking about the vote, do we want an administration that is going to bury its head in the sand, that wants to privatize our access to weather information the same way they privatize checking out these factories and checking on these slaughterhouses and privatize Boar's Head right out of a brand? Is that the approach that we want to govern, or do we want a science-driven, data-driven, research-driven understanding of what's happening? A science-driven, data-driven, research-driven understanding about what the response should look like? And then here's the other thing. This is not the only way that this has to go. Right? I was reading a number, and I'm so glad I just saw this. I almost forgot. I want to make sure I get to this point. There are other ways of approaching these sorts of disasters. I was reading from some Twitter users who are from Asian countries. One in particular was tweeting out of Vietnam. And what he was saying was, it's so crazy because Vietnam just had a massive cyclone. That's what they call hurricanes. A massive cyclone smack into the entire north of the country, and volunteers immediately began assembling MREs, which are meals ready to eat, that contained bandages, shampoo, disinfectant, beer, cigarettes, a lighter, and the police began using police drones to deliver the supplies personally to flood victims, so there was no need to loot or worry about your baby starving. And this user is Deucex Moniker. I don't follow them. DEUSEXMONIKER. I don't follow them, but this is what they were talking about. A different form of governmental response to disaster. So as you hear that, they had a hurricane, and in those hurricanes, they immediately had meals ready to eat that had all sorts of resources that you would need to survive in the immediacy of the aftermath. And then they had drones, the police drones. In New York City, our drones, our police kill you if you miss $2.90 on the subway. But in other countries, the police drones, as opposed to being used to weaponize and spy against people, are actually used to deliver support. And so those meals ready to eat and those care packages were delivered by police drones. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? They go on to say, I know a lot of folks have said Vietnam is a lot smaller than America. No, dog. It's almost 1/3 of the population of the U.S. and 1/60th of the wealth. It just comes down to being a society that cares about every single person and refuses to leave someone behind. They said that the typhoon that crashed Vietnam and China is one of the biggest storms to make impact in modern history. It's a lot easier to have all hands on deck when you haven't sent those hands to the Middle East to backstop assassinations and genocide. Ooh. Ooh. Okay. He goes on to say, where did all the volunteers come from? They come from everywhere. We have an 88%, this is Vietnam. We have an 88% home ownership rate in this country. You can take off work for weeks without having to worry about capitalist vultures putting you on the street or in debt for being a patriot, right? And then they show pictures of the morale boosters, these flood relief care packages that are going all over Vietnam, all over the country to make sure people have what they need. And then he says, welcome to market socialism. We can have nice things. We can have nice things, but we have to demand them from our government. 866-801-8255, 866-801-TALK is the number. Bye, Instagram.